Welcome to Spooky Ass Shit. I am your host, Eric Dwinells. I almost forgot to say my name for some reason just then. I don't think it seemed like that big a pause though, but for some reason I did almost forget to say my name. But I am Eric Dwinells, and I am joined tonight by a returning guest making her second appearance, a true blue spookaroo, Susan Barrett.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be on the show again. I'm looking forward to chatting about this with you.
So tonight we have a very interesting subject, and we actually, Susan and I haven't discussed our personal feelings on the subject, but I have to be a little bit honest and say I think I'm kind of walking a line on this one. And we'll talk about exactly why and all that stuff, and hopefully it doesn't make me sound like too big of a creep. Tonight we are talking about Murderabilia. And if you're a true crime fan, is fan the right word? I mean, you know, we are fans of true crime shows and all that kind of stuff, but we're not fans of crime itself, I assume.
We're interested in it.
So Murderabilia would be the collecting of items related to either a crime or a criminal or their victim. So we're going to talk about that, but before we do, as always, of course, I want to point you all to the show's website. That is spookyas.com or spookyasshit.com. They both take you to the exact same place, and that is the show's blog page. From there, you can listen to each and every episode of Spooky AS, even the ones that are no longer available on iTunes. They are all still there and all still functioning. I just checked them. And you can also find links to our social media. We are at Spooky Ass Shit on both Twitter and Instagram. And you can like us on Facebook at facebook.com/spookyas. And while you're there, don't forget to click on the link to join the Spookaroos. That is our private, closed Facebook group. So you have to be approved to join, but don't worry, we'll approve you. And as long as you don't, pester everybody and become a problem on the page, you're welcome to stay and have a good time with all your Spookaroo friends and talk about true crime and murderabilia and horror movies and what you're watching on Netflix and all that kind of stuff without the weight of public judgment upon you. And again, I'll point out the Spookaroo private group was Susan's idea. So thank you once again, Susan.
It's my pleasure, and I enjoy the group. It's fun to interact with the fellow Spookaroos, and Halloween was a fun time in the group, and I'd encourage people to join.
Yeah, it's definitely a good group. So I don't know. I guess I'm not very witty tonight. I was like, I'll say something good here, but no, I just said the exact same thing you just said. I already told Susan I'm not I'm not feeling too great tonight, so we'll see how this one goes. But I think it's such an interesting subject, I'll be able to power through. So
I have total confidence in you.
Yeah. So I emailed Susan and I said, hey, do you want to do this episode about Murderabilia? And I thought it might be good because she is somewhat knowledgeable of the law in general, maybe not these laws in particular, but I thought it might be good to have a lawyer's opinion on things here as we move through, because there are some legal issues involved with the sale of Murderabilia, and she was all for it. So, Susan, when I emailed you, did you have any thoughts about Murderabilia? Had you heard the term before? Are you aware of what it was?
Sure. Yeah. My sort of overall, the first thing I think of is the actual convicted perpetrator of the crime financially benefiting from somehow some evidence of us directly associated with the crime. And I have my own opinion about that. But there's a lot more sort of nuance. There's a lot of folds in this. And it's some things about it, in my opinion, are fairly black and white. And a lot of it isn't. And there's a lot to get into.
So let's do it. So the Wikipedia definition of Murderabilia is that it is the term identifying items related to murders, murderers, or other violent crimes. This can include items used in a crime, including the weapons used to perpetrate the crime, items taken from the crime scene, or items owned or created by the criminal or their victim. Buyers will seek out anything connected with high profile killers, including fingernail clippings, letters, and artwork, clothing, basically anything that you can think of. I even saw one. So we're going to get into the websites in a little bit, but I'm not going to name names. If you want to find Murderabilia, that's on you to find on your own. But trust me, it's not that hard to find. But I saw on one website they were selling like envelopes used by the prison just with the person's like stamp on it. Like it wasn't really necessarily anything that they had owned or anything like that, or like visitor approval sheets or something like that. So yeah, there's a really wide variety and kind of a weird variety of things that are available even as we record this episode online.
Right.
The first question is, who wants to buy these items? Now, if you listen to this show, you probably know that I am kind of what you might call a geek, and that I, love what I love, and I am kind of a fanboy for certain things, including horror movies, including, say, Friday the 13th. Now, if someone came and said to me that somebody was auctioning off the original hockey mask used in Friday the 13th Part 3, I would be interested. I would like to own that item. I know it won't happen. I will never be able to afford it. I can't imagine how much it would sell for, but if it's more than $100, it ain't coming to me. But that is something I'd be very interested in. Now, as far as actual crimes go, that's obviously a different story. I said earlier that I kind of walk a line here, and I walk a line in the sense that I don't through some like ghoulish curiosity or morbidity. That's not the what's the word I'm trying to say?
Morbidity.
Is that the word?
No, it's not morbidity. It's morbidness.
Yeah. I don't know. Anyway,
whatever.
It's not because I'm, some ghoul who wants to own the knife that stabbed so and so or something like that. But also I would say, not to Indiana Jones this, but if it's a famous crime that shaped culture in one way or another, for better or worse, I do think it's possible that it belongs in a museum. Now, when I say a museum, I don't mean like Ma and Pa's Murder Museum, on Long Beach or something like that, like some kind of kitschy tourist sideshow kind of thing. For example, Lizzie Borden was accused of murdering her parents back in the late 1800s. Very famous case here in Massachusetts where it happened. And they don't think that they actually have the murder weapon, but what they thought was the murder weapon at the time was a hatchet. And they have the head of that hatchet on display at the Fall River Historical Society. And that is something that I would be interested in seeing.
And what's the context of the display? Like, is it displayed as, here's the horrible weapon kind of thing, or here's the suspected part of the horrible weapon kind of thing? Like, I think when you mentioned sort of, being interested in getting like the hockey mask, but why and what's the feeling it gives you versus what's the feeling something from a crime gives you to actually have it?
Well, see, that's where I think I might diverge from some true Murderabilia collectors, right? Because to me, it's cool to have the Jason mask. It's cool to think, oh, they used this in the movie. This is what he was wearing. It's really cool. Like, this is an iconic thing. But let's say, for example, I'm drawing a blank on masked killers, although there have been a few, so I won't use that example. But let's say someone had the knife that killed Sharon Tate, right? To me, that's not something I would want to own or have in my personal collection.
Exactly right. It's creepy.
It is creepy, but I'm
and
sure...
not the good kind, not the kind we like.
But the thing is, I bet that there are people that you and I would get along with in real life who actually would be interested in owning that. And
Totally agree.
like this is the knife that was actually used. And maybe they're not, getting off on thinking about it, murdering Sharon Tate per se, but just the fact that this was a Manson family knife. It was used in a very famous crime.
It's a historical artifact kind of
Yeah,
thing.
this was a very big deal, and now it belongs to me, and it's in my house, and maybe it's got some kind of dark energy or something like that. I can see where people would think that way. I'm not that kind of person. To me, I don't believe in those kind of energy vibes anyway. But even if it did have a dark energy, that's not an energy I want around.
Right. Right. It's I mean, some of the items, a lot of my opinions about it kind of depend on the what the item is, but then and sort of how it's linked to the crime, but also it's what does that person want to do with it? Are they sort of fetishizing it in a weird way where they think it gives them powers or something? That I'd prefer not to have happen, but I don't know that it's something you can make illegal. Um, there's a lot to it. But versus just sort of being interested in a historical artifact or something that's just interesting, like that crime is interesting, the Sharon Tate murder. Um, and that's maybe a little bit different thing from really kind of wanting it because you want that killer's essence or something.
Well, so that kind of thing, I bet there are people like that. But I also bet that is rarer than the first two, which is the kind of historic aspect and the kind of like I can't, this is the item and it was, like the one I was talking about earlier. But yes, the like, oh, this is the item, so now I have the power. I'm sure there are people out there like that, or people who really do like think it's kind of maybe funny is not the right word, but for their own amusement that they have these things and can kind of be like, oh, this is the knife, isn't it? Like, oh, look out, they got her good. I'm sure those people are out there. I've seen them on TV, as a matter of fact. I've probably seen them in Salem.
We've probably met them and just don't know it.
Yeah, they haven't. They're not in the Spookaroos.
Yeah,
we haven't.
None of us would do that.
So if you remember, a few years back, not a few years back, maybe earlier this past year, I did an episode about the babysitter slayer.
Yeah.
And I could not find a good picture of his victim. And I did find one online, but it was actually owned by a website called Historic Images. I think that's what it was called. And it had and they were selling it. And it was a picture, it was like a picture that would have gone out to the Associated Press or whatever, and they would have used it in the newspaper stories about this murder.
Yeah.
Out of respect to the victim, I wanted a nice, clean picture without their watermark on it, which also would be illegal to take. I bought the picture. And I was not considering it murderabilia at the time. I just got it because I wanted it to present to you listeners and again, to be respectful of the memory of this girl. But when I got the picture, even though it was not at all in any way, shape, or form directly related to the crime, when I opened the picture and I thought to myself, this is a 14-year-old girl who didn't get to live her life.
Yeah.
That kind of hit me, and then when I looked on the back, there's handwritten notes from like the newspaper people who were using the photo. And it said like girl number 2 victim, throat slit or whatever it said. And I was like, and that's what her life is. Like that's what people know her now. Like she's always going to be known as murder victim.
Right.
So that hit me really like heavily. So for me, I don't know, it's just hard to imagine then like getting stoked over owning like a murder weapon or something. But I'm sure there are those people out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So where are people buying this stuff? Well, before the internet, I don't know. But now that we have the internet, there are many, many places you can buy. Those places do not include eBay, which banned the sale of Murderabilia all the way back in 2001, although it was allowed on the site before that. And Facebook, they don't necessarily explicitly ban it, but if they find out that you're doing it, they will shut down your shop. So I guess they kind of do ban it, just under their policies guideline of you have to be selling inoffensive material. So if someone points out that someone is selling Murderabilia, they have taken that store down. But of course, like I said, there's websites. I found at least 4, I think, like without even really trying, just 4 that came up right on Google when I typed in Murderabilia.
Yeah, I bet we came up with the same 4.
And again, looked through some of the items. Did you want to talk about that, Susan? It seemed like you had some thoughts.
Well, I mean, so like you had mentioned earlier, like there are some sort of less directly associated items like envelopes or the photocopies of letters and things like that. I that doesn't particularly sort of alarm me, but then the 2 items that most struck me are George Zimmerman's gun,
Yeah.
um, and that Parkland School gravel. That may be me as a parent just kind of feeling like um, those are particularly emotionally difficult things, but I also think it's just kind of gruesome. And then it's an interesting fold that Zimmerman wasn't actually convicted, and so it's not per se sort of,
Yeah.
I
So
will call it murderabilia because I have my feelings about that, but it's, it's a little bit different from that. It's some kind of justifiable homicide-abilia.
yeah. Oh well, I mean, to be fair, Zimmerman does seem like a complete piece of shit.
Right. I mean, I think regardless of what any court has said, yes.
Hold on one moment. Let's go back a little bit because we probably, I know for a fact that we have listeners that are not from the United States, and let's just make sure everybody knows what we're discussing here. So, George Zimmerman, his name was George, right? I think I got that. George Zimmerman, he shot an unarmed black teenager and claimed that it was Trayvon Martin, and he claimed that it was basically self-defense and that he was standing his ground. And in fact, they use a law called the Stand Your Ground Law. He said that Trayvon looked threatening, that he, wasn't someone who belonged in the neighborhood. He was a young black male wearing a hoodie and carrying a candy bar. So George Zimmerman took it upon himself to shoot this teenager, and he died. And then George Zimmerman was put on trial, but he was found not guilty of murder. And even though he definitely did it, but they were saying that he basically thought he was defending himself, so we can't find him guilty. I don't know exactly how that happened. To me, I don't know. I guess they said that the intention wasn't murder, so therefore his intention matters. There's a lot more to the case. That's not really what we're talking about, but there's racial overtones and all that, very strong overtones. So yeah. So the gun that he used in that murder, shooting, murder. He himself sold that gun, and I have the price. Where was it? I have how much he sold it for. He sold it for 200 and no, I have $250,000.
Okay. Yeah,
So
that's ridiculous. I mean, so and
money
he has the ability to then spend that money.
right,
And he
what you were
shot
saying.
this child.
Yeah, and what you were saying, Susan, is that in his case, there's not even a legal question because he was not found guilty of the crime.
Right.
We're going to get into the legality in a little bit, but basically, as far as convicted criminals go, there is a little bit of, can they actually sell these things legally? And people try to fight it, and sometimes they can, and sometimes they kind of can't. But in his case, there wasn't even a question. Like, no, he was found innocent, so he gets to keep this gun, and he can do whatever he wants with it. And he decided to sell it, which just shows you the classy guy he is.
Appalling. I mean, if somebody paid him that much for it.
Yeah, well,
I tend to want to vote with my dollars, and I just cannot imagine being a party to that transaction.
Yeah.
Like, it's disgusting.
I don't know. That's one of the ones I don't quite understand myself. But the other one that you brought up was the Parkland incident, which was a school shooting. And what one of these websites did was they had someone go to the school and get some rocks from outside of the school, and they said like, "Hey, we got these rocks from the Parkland school shooting," and I don't know how much they were sold for, but actually I think it was $80, wasn't it?
I think that's right. And like it, that one is gruesome. And but it's got this other piece that bothers me about it too, which is it's totally unverifiable. Like that could be gravel from that person's backyard that you're buying as Parkland school gravel and paying that person for,
Yeah.
and it's total bullshit.
Yeah, we'll get into that in a little bit. Those kinds of things, I want to say that I can't understand.
But
We
on
can
the other,
imagine.
but
But
well,
well,
the
the
thing
thing
is,
is,
like
like
on
on
the
the
other
other
hand,
hand,
when
when
I
I
think
think
about
about
something
something
like
like
Lizzie
Lizzie
Borden,
Borden
or
or
going
going
back
back
as
as
well,
well,
maybe
maybe
the
the
Bloody
Bloody
Benders
Benders
or
or
something
something
like
like
that.
that.
Um,
Um,
I
I
guess I
guess I
wouldn't
wouldn't
buy
buy
it,
it,
but
but
I
I
can
can
see
see
where
where
people
people
might
might
be
be
interested
interested
in
in
owning
owning
like
like
a
a
brick
brick
from
from
the
the
foundation
foundation
of
of
the
the
basement
basement
of
of
the
the
house.
house.
Right, right.
I personally wouldn't care because it's a brick, whatever. But I can understand where some people might. So this one seems appalling to us because we're living through the moment now. But I mean, I don't really imagine that this is true. But maybe in the future this is going to be a big significant moment in history, and that's why they want this rock. And
I don't know. I mean,
Sure.
I'm just trying to play devil's advocate.
but
Sure. I mean that would be the only way to kind of or a way to give benefit of the doubt.
So I mean, I myself wouldn't be down with it. And if someone was like, "Oh, look, I got rocks from the Parkland school shooting," I would question why I was hanging out with that person, maybe.
but
Right. I mean, I would be saying like, no, you bought rocks from somebody's landscaping, but whatever.
yeah.
Just to finish off who sells them, so we have the websites. It's come up before that the criminals themselves will sell the items occasionally via online stores and that kind of thing. That depends basically here in the United States, state to state, because some states might actually allow that kind of thing to happen, including Massachusetts, where there is no Son of Sam law, where I am.
Um,
Really?
Yeah. Someone else who has been known to sell what we might consider murderabilia is the United States government. They auctioned off Ted Kaczynski's items. Ted Kaczynski was the Unabomber. He was known for sending bombs for many, many years to usually like professors and like business leaders, right? If I'm remembering correctly,
because
Correct.
he wanted to get back to the woods and like live off the land, and he was like an evil genius.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, you kind of broke up. I could tell that you were saying something, but I didn't get it.
Oh, I was saying about Ted Kaczynski. I was just saying, we all want to get back to nature. It's
oh,
totally understandable.
Yeah, but you don't have to bomb everybody else to make that point. But yeah, so he was living alone in a cabin in the woods, which of course is where all the best people live, in an old abandoned cabin in the woods. When the police caught him, they eventually sold all of his items online in an auction, and so this could be considered murderabilia. But the proceeds, at least, went to the victims and the victims' families. So I guess some good came out of it, but it's a little bit like blood money because they're selling these items which people are probably only interested in because they are connected to a crime and a criminal, but at least the profits for this are benefiting the victims.
Exactly. I mean, that to me, I guess I would have the question, are they being sold with the cooperation of the victim's family? Like, did they know about it ahead of time and were they okay with that? And then in that case, it to me is kind of it's not hurting anybody. I still would have questions, I guess, about who's buying it. But
Yeah.
that's a little bit different example.
When they are sold on the websites, from what I've seen, most items cost somewhere between $100 to $1,000 for items that belonged to well-known criminals. But if you are, a big famous murderer, celebrity in that sense, you can fetch more. Like a signed photo of Charles Manson can get $500. Artwork and hand traces, like they trace their hand like you would have in like elementary school to make a turkey, I've seen that a lot on different websites. Hand traces and signed letters also tend to sell well and can fetch more money. It's said that Charles Manson's dentures were listed for $50,000. I don't know if they sold or not. And Ted Bundy's glasses were offered at $75,000.
And then where does that money go?
That's a good question.
Yeah. I guess that's a lot.
Yeah.
If it were to go to victim family, I would feel one way about that. I don't think that's probably the case.
From the websites I was looking at, and I'm sure the ones you were looking at, I don't think that is what's happening. No. These websites seem very exploitive, which is why I'm not going to mention them by name. Although, like I said, I'm sure people will look them up if they really want to. Where does the money go is a very good question, because on the surface, you might think, well, listen, I'm not really hurting anything. I'm not buying this directly from the killer, so it's not like they're getting the money. I'm buying this from a website, and yes, this person is being exploitive, but they have things that I want for whatever reason. So, yes, I'm giving them the money, but it's not really hurting anything, except for me and my bank account. But the truth of the matter is they have to be getting this stuff from somewhere. So, it seems that a lot of the times, especially in states with a Son of Sam law, by the way, Son of Sam law basically, in a nutshell, we're going to get into it deeper in a little bit, but in a nutshell means that you can't profit off of a crime that you committed. So you can't, you can't be a serial killer and then say, hey, I wrote a book about being, my crimes, being a serial killer and everything. Give me millions of dollars. So that's a very controversial. It's not a law. It's a term used for any kind of law like that. And like I said, we'll get into it in a little bit. But just in case you're not familiar, that's what that is. That I've said several times. So hopefully now you can think back and remember what I was talking about. The problem with the thought that your purchase doesn't hurt anything, actually, in these states where there is a Son of Sam law, what they believe happens is that the inmate, because most of these people are inmates now, has in one way or another smuggled these items out of prison so that they can be sold online. And are they smuggling these items out of prison out of the kindness of their heart for their fans, if that's the way we want to phrase it, which I'm not sure it is, but the answer is probably not. They have probably worked out some kind of deal either with the website directly or with the person providing the items to the website, which would be like an intermediary person. So like, I go to visit Charles Manson. He gives me a hug at the end of the visit and pops a few pictures into my pocket. I take those out. I go to, website X and say, hey, website owner, I've got these pictures signed and created by Charles Manson. If you want to buy them, you pay me this much, and then you can sell them however much you want. I'll kick back a little bit to Charlie, put it in his commissary, and then, we're good. So in that way, they are able to profit still from their crimes and from their notoriety from committing these crimes.
Exactly.
Before we move on, let's talk about a point that you brought up earlier, actually, Susan, which is, are these items even legit?
Oh, yeah.
I would be very, very weary of buying any of these items from these websites.
Absolutely.
A lot of them do offer certificate of authenticities, but from who? Like what? Yeah, from the website. Well, if you just have somebody say so, that's not good enough. Especially if it's someone who runs an exploitive website that deals in murderabilia. Is that the kind of person you want to trust to, deliver you authentic, historical goods? If that's the way that's the tack you're trying to think of it on, um, I would say to be very suspicious. They probably do have legit ones on there, but like you said, Susan, it's so easy to fake so many things. You could say, "Oh,
Yeah.
One of the kind of, I guess, popular items are like John Wayne Gacy's artwork. And that to me seems at least kind of verifiable because he's got a style.
yeah, he was real shitty, by the way.
Pardon me?
He's a shitty artist."
Right. I mean, but you can see a Gacy. Um, but then you've got like items like that gravel from Parkland, and then you've got like even Manson's hair does not seem like that could be anybody's hair. There are a lot of photocopies of items, like photocopied letters that even, if you assume the that the letter was really written by the person, I'm not really sure what we're doing with a photo. I don't know what I think about that, I guess.
In some senses, like that makes a little more sense to me because, if you become fascinated by a certain crime, like you and I are both very interested in the Golden State Killer case. Again, I don't know that I'd pay money for it, but if someone said like, "Oh, I have some letters that he wrote here, and some of them talk about his ex-wife or whatever," I'd want to read those. Yeah, sure. Even if or see a photocopy or whatever. Again, maybe I wouldn't pay money for it, especially these websites, but it's something I'd be interested in seeing. So I don't think I don't think in that case it's too big a leap to make for me. I kind of get it there.
Right. Like I could see like looking at, like, if you were to look at a court file and get copies, you pay for those. Like I could see paying for a copy of something out of like a case file if I was particularly interested. Like in that case, if I want to look at something in the Golden State Killer case, I could see paying $5 for a copy. And that's fine. It goes to the county. It's fine.
Right. But not some guy who's running a website that...
Exactly right. I'm not buying it from some weird sort of broker of items, of murderabilia.
All right, so Susan, let's talk about the Son of Sam law. Let's really get into that. Again, the Wikipedia definition is the Son of Sam law is a term. It's not an actual law in and of itself, except in one state, New York, where that was the actual name of the law, but other states, they just kind of acquired that term. It's a term for any law designed to keep criminals from profiting off the publicity of their crimes, often by selling their stories to be made into books or movies or something like that. Such laws often authorize the state to seize money earned from such deals, including books or movie biographies or paid interviews, and this money will be used to compensate the criminal's victims. It is named after the serial killer David Berkowitz, who was also known as the Son of Sam. He was known for shooting couples on lovers' lanes in New York City in the late 70s, although he now claims that he did not act alone and he was part of a satanic cult, but that's a story for another day. And by the way, I kind of believe him, but we'll get to that another day. Now, there's controversy around this law, though, perhaps surprisingly, because I'm sure you'll feel the same way, Susan, knowing the bit that I do about you, that, like, yes, naturally it seems to make sense that if you commit a major crime, you shouldn't be able to turn around and then say, "Oh, I committed a major crime. Check out this book now."
Right, exactly. So as you mentioned, it looks like Massachusetts they had a Son of Sam law, but it was repealed and not replaced.
Yeah, and that seems to happen a lot in a lot of different states.
Yeah. So the California one had been repealed because it was deemed to basically go too far, and it was deemed to be unconstitutional on that basis. But it's replaced with another code section, and the code section basically just puts a statute of limitations on the civil case against a defendant being initiated within 10 years of the conviction. So it puts a statute of limitations on the claim to recover against whatever the profit was.
Yeah, I'm actually. Well, we're going to get into that in a bit because we're going to talk about the O.J. Simpson case
Yes.
in particular. But before we do, let's just finish up talking about the Son of Sam law in general. As you mentioned, a lot of the critics against the law argue that it infringes on the freedom of speech and therefore violates the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. And this doesn't really jive with me. Like, yeah, they should be allowed to say whatever they want, but does that mean they can, make money off of it? That's a different issue if you ask me.
Yeah, it's pretty fundamental to, like, obviously I went to law school in California, so I don't know what, it varies greatly from state to state, but that's a pretty kind of fundamental precept of a lot of like the underlying tenets of the laws is you don't profit from a crime. Like it's really fundamentally woven into all of the other kind of ways that the criminal law, civil laws play together.
But a lot of these people will further argue that like you can't just take away the financial incentive, because if that's the case, you're going to take away the incentive for them to tell their crimes, to tell their stories at all. And some of those stories, such as the Watergate scandal or the assassination of John F. Kennedy, are vital to the general public.
To get and well, yeah, it takes away an incentive for someone to make a confession. So would we rather, encourage a confession and possibly risk somebody profiting off their crime, versus just saying, no, you're not gonna.
I don't know. I don't know how much stock I put in that though, because if you're you're already convicted, and then you're gonna confess after the fact.
Well, like thinking of somebody who like gets arrested for, let's say, or they've got evidence of 2 murders, but they're suspected of like 7 more or something like that.
Yeah.
Like in the state case of a Golden State Killer, maybe he's got, I think, 26 charges pending.
I guess that's more likely, but yeah, I don't know. These laws tend to come up into trouble though, because of what you said earlier, that in most cases it seems to be that they think the laws are just too general. They need to be a little bit more specific. For example, the actual Son of Sam law in New York City was challenged starting in 1987, when lawyers for the publishing company Simon & Schuster sued New York to prevent the enforcement of the Son of Sam laws, because they were getting ready to release the book Wise Guy. Now, Wise Guy is a book that was written about the life of ex-New York mobster Henry Hill, and this book was used as the basis for one of the best movies of all time, Goodfellas. The case reached all the way to the federal Supreme Court in 1991, and in an 8-0 ruling, the court ruled that the law was, in fact, unconstitutional. And the majority opinion was that the law was just a little too general, a little over-inclusive, and it would have prevented the publication of such works as the autobiography of Malcolm X, Henry David Thoreau's Civil Disobedience, and the Confessions of St. Augustine, as they were all written by people who were technically convicted felons, and they all discussed crimes that those people committed.
Right. And so what do we think about that? What's the net? Do we think that's a net benefit?
It's a little hard to say because the only one of those books that I've read, by the way, is Civil Disobedience by Thoreau. I'm a huge Thoreau fan. I highly recommend Walden. To talk about unspooky things for a second, if you have not read Walden, that's one of those books that I read it and every few sentences I'm like, yes, preach, go on, tell him. Civil Disobedience was about him standing up to the government and not supporting a war that he didn't believe in. And he would not pay taxes, the money for which would go to support this war. He thought it was, not right that the government would force him to support a war financially that he didn't believe in, and so he went to jail. He only spent a night in jail, and then his friend came and paid his tax for him, and, but he wrote this book, Civil Disobedience, about it, and that's an important and now historical work. So I think that it would be a loss.
Humanity would be worse off if we lacked that. Yes.
Right.
But was that a felony then if he spent a night in jail? And then so should we be considering, like, that's not per se murderabilia.
No.
Like I can see making a distinction between what I would consider to be kind of a victimless crime versus, something like a murder. And maybe there should be a distinction between whether it's something that belonged to, I didn't see anything, I don't think, on the websites about that was property of a victim. It was property of the convicted person, from what I saw in letters and things like that.
Right.
That to me would be a huge distinction, like nothing belonging to a victim. Just like assume that out of our picture, but maybe that's the distinction: is was there a victim of this crime, and what do they think about it?
That is something to consider. But to go back to a point that you made earlier, where you were saying, well, civil disobedience is a different crime than murder. Of course, that's true. But on the other hand, this.
What's that?
I said that's one I like, but I was kidding. I was being facetious.
No, but that's a good point. But then the other problem is who gets to determine that? Who gets to determine what the line is? Of course, we could just say, well, murder's the line. That's the line.
But also, do we want to see like Rapeabilia being sold places?
Right, and well, maybe those are the lines, right? But in a historical sense, is murder? Rape is always unjustified, I would imagine. I can't say that, like there's any important historical,
yeah, but I think we can make a blanket statement on that.
Yeah. But for example, Thoreau was arrested for a reason, because at that time the government said this is the way it is. So presumably enough people believed in it. But we look at it now and we think, yeah, but he had belief and he believed in something. But then on the other hand, to this day, try not paying your taxes and see what happens.
Well, right. So that I'm actually fine with that. Because I think I guess the victim of that is the government. And right now, especially, I'm super fine with that. So I don't know, that one to me is sort of like that's an important protected kind of speech. I'm not advocating not paying your taxes, but for, that's the kind of thing that needs to be protected.
Like I said, the original Son of Sam law was eventually overturned in the 90s, but New York came back and wrote some revisions and created a new Son of Sam law in 2001. This law requires, this is kind of like the one you have in California, I guess, because it requires that the victims of a crime be notified when a criminal, convicted person, receives $10,000 or more from pretty much any source. The law then attaches a statute of limitations, letting the victims know that they have, so many years or whatever to sue the perpetrator of the crime in order to get some of this money.
Right.
The law also authorizes a state agency, the Crime Victims Board, to act on the victim's behalf in some limited circumstances. And so far, this law has survived every court that it's been thrown into.
Yeah, it looks like they put in, like, they made some terms more, like, they more clearly defined exactly what constitutes profit of a crime, and then put in that limitations period to kind of speak to what I interpreted the concern was, that it goes to, I think there were examples that were just completely unrelated to the crime, that it was kind of like, just anytime this person wrote about any topic, they would not be able to receive the profit from it.
Yeah, well, that's what it says is, pretty much any reason they get money. So that's kind of another issue in this thing. Okay, so you can't make money off selling your rights to the story of the crime. Okay, you can't make money from selling items directly related to the crime. You can't make money from items taken from the crime scene, or anything involved in the planning of the crime or anything like that. Let's say that all that is out, right? Can they still make money from drawing a picture and selling that?
Right. It is based on, like, if you extrapolate this out, they're basically saying everything that the convicted person ever does for the rest of their life is going to be a crime. Like, if he's painting pictures of landscapes or whatever, non-clowns, is that really related to the crime at all? And if they're done 15 years later, at what point do we say, okay, this is no longer related to this series of incidents?
Right. Actually, just an interesting point along the same line, since we brought him up earlier, Henry Hill, the guy from Goodfellas,
Right.
he was someone who did start, selling his own paintings later in life. He just passed away, actually, not too long ago. But he was selling his own paintings. And I remember seeing an interview with him, and he said, yeah, I do all kinds of paintings, but the ones that always sell are the ones that I do that have guns in them.
Oh, isn't that interesting?
So it wasn't necessarily that he wanted to paint guns, but he made more money when he drew paintings of guns.
Well, and that speaks to the demand side of it and why people want these items. I mean, what that kind of tells me is the people who wanted his art, to have his artwork, wanted to have it. So it would be like a Henry Hill with guns. But then is that his fault, and does he not get to make a living?
So it's a very interesting case as far as this goes is the O.J. Simpson case.
Now, the O.J. case.
This is one people have talked about and will talk about for quite a long time. O.J. Simpson, for those of you who might not remember, was accused of murdering his ex-wife and a gentleman by the name of Ron Goldman, very brutally. And he was put on trial for this murder, but he was found innocent despite basically everything pointing to the fact that he did it. But that's another story. He was found innocent in the criminal case. However, the families of the murder victims then had him tried again in civil court. Correct me if I'm wrong, Susan. I know this is not necessarily your branch of the law, but
if you have
well, this case was, I had just started law school, and the firm that I worked in was, they actually were watching it on TV during the day in the office. So yeah, the issue is you have got a burden of proof in your case that is basically beyond a reasonable doubt, and your burden of proof in a civil case is a preponderance of the evidence. So it's sort of a 51%. And so it's obviously a higher burden in your criminal case. And that's why essentially you can be found or not guilty in your criminal case, and then that doesn't create a presumption that you're not still civilly liable because the burden of proof is lower. And that's why typically cases are tried in that order. If you are convicted on the criminal case, you are going to be civilly liable because it's a higher burden of proof. And then that second trial, essentially, I don't know if it literally is not necessary, but you're not looking at the liability piece of it. You're just looking at damages.
Right. So in the civil trial, basically what they're saying is, we find that you are more likely than not responsible for these crimes happening.
Exactly right. Correct.
Even if you're not criminally responsible.
Even if somehow it was determined that there was not enough evidence that was true beyond a reasonable doubt because of those ill-fitting gloves. But yes, that doesn't mean we still don't have sort of that 51% to tip the scales in a civil case.
Right. So he would not be under any scrutiny as far as these Son of Sam laws go. But where he was found guilty in the civil case, this meant that the Goldman family in particular, Ronald Goldman's father, is always on TV, and he is always a victim advocate, and especially in this particular case, and he is not letting people forget that O.J. Simpson, more likely than not, murdered his son. And he won the civil case, and they awarded him over, I think, $30 million, I think was the number. $30 million.
I don't know off the top of my head. I'll believe you.
O.J. claimed that he didn't have this kind of money, and so that, Ron Goldman wouldn't be able to collect on it, right? And there's whole backstories involved with that, and different ways of, how they did try to get some of this money to the Goldman family. But one thing that happened was O.J. Simpson wrote a book, and the book was called If I Did It.
Oh, O.J.
In this book, he talks theoretically. He says, if I were to have killed Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman, this is how I would have done it if I had done it. But I didn't do it. But if I had, this is how I would have done it.
What the hell is wrong with people?
Did you read that book, by the way?
No. Did you?
I did. I
Really?
got it from the library. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this is the closest we're going to get to a confession from him. Maybe I'll do a whole episode about that book someday, because it's very interesting. But basically, it's not an amazing read, aside from the sense that, like, you can't believe he's saying this, like, at all. But
it's amazing that it exists.
Yeah, he invents another character. I forget what he named him, but he had this friend with him that night in his theoretical story.
Oh, jeez.
And he keeps interrupting the narrative to tell you that it's theoretical. Keep in mind, I'm not saying I did this.
Now, let's remember, the book is called If I Did This.
So anyway, he wrote this book where him and his invisible friend murdered these people, and explained how it happened. And he even talks about Ron Goldman getting into a karate stance to, try to fight him off and everything. Like, he gives these details. And to me, that's what's interesting about it, is these probably are true details of what actually happened, and he's the only one that can tell us, if only that dog could talk, Nicole Brown Simpson's dog. But anyway, who witnessed it, or at least walked in through the crime scene. But anyway, when it was discovered that he had written this book in an attempt to help satisfy the financial judgment from the civil case against him, the court awarded the Goldman family the rights to the book. So they are actually the ones who published it, not O.J. Simpson. That's why, if you ever see the book cover, it looks like the book is called I Did It. because the if is about 8-point font.
And the
that's really fun.
Yeah, the I did it is like 200 font or whatever. So it looks like a book called I Did It by O.J. Simpson.
I might read it then. If I know that the proceeds go to the family, I'll get it on my Kindle.
Yeah, it's an interesting story in any event, but that's how they kind of they kind of skirted around the issues with the Son of Sam law, because he owed them this money. So if you're going to make money off this book, guess what? That money is going to the Goldman family, not to you.
Exactly right. Yeah. Well, and it's yeah, I mean, and they had a judgment, against him, and it's a way for them to collect on it.
Right.
So.
All right, so maybe we'll come back and talk about that book someday. But for this episode, Susan, is there any final thoughts you have on Murderabilia or anything that we've discussed that maybe swayed you a little bit or gave you something to think about?
I would say, now that we've discussed it, I think to me, the nature of the crime and this kind of specific nature of the item, meaning I don't want to see body parts, and who profits from it, for me are the most important, versus is this whole concept good or bad? And then I have a lot of questions about people who collect Murderabilia and what their reasons for doing it are, not out of judgment, but just out of curiosity. It's an interesting topic.
From what I read online, which was only like maybe 3 people or so, but people who said that they bought it, one was saying like, oh, for the history of it. One person was saying that they did it as an investment, because they think that these items are only going to appreciate in value, which is like a different kind of ghoul, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, I could kind of see that, I guess.
Well, I'm not saying it's a good reason, but it's a reason.
Definitely ghoulish. I mean, I could consider that as a college fund for. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. Well, to go back about my idea of like, if it's a historically relevant crime, although I don't know how you would exactly determine that necessarily, but if it was relevant to the culture, for examples, I could see where, Lizzie Borden, Charles Manson family, Ted Bundy,
John Wayne Gacy.
If you go on like a big scale, I mean, the Holocaust Museum is a bunch of murderabilia, and it's important and respectfully presented.
Yes, that's the key, I think, is how it's presented, which is a point that you brought up earlier too. I think of, have you seen the movie House of a Thousand Corpses?
Yes.
So the scene, Captain Spaulding's world famous murder ride,
right,
and fried chicken stand. That's when I hear about people buying Murderabilia, especially when I see the websites like this. That's kind of what I picture them doing with it, to be honest with you.
Exactly right.
Yeah, but I would hope for something more like you might see, in a historical society, or maybe like a real museum, like a historical museum, when it's a crime of significance for one reason or another.
Well, yeah, consider, if you were of what slavery looked like, you would expect, you kind of want it to be presented as horribly as it occurred, because that's what's important for people to know.
So just to go back to wrap up on a point that we kind of began on, the Lizzie Borden hatchet, for example, when I say that I'm interested in seeing it, I don't mean because like, oh, that's the one that she used to, hack up her father and stepmother. But you want to see it in the sense of like, you kind of want to picture it, in the correct context. Like you want to imagine, I've been to the house on tours. And so now when I think of the crime, it's not this obscure kind of thing that I'm, thinking about, it's like, oh, I remember what that room looked like. And when you think about the hatchet, in my mind, and in most movies and stuff, it's not portrayed as a hatchet, it's portrayed as an axe. And even in the famous, rhyme, Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her father 40 whacks, or mother 40 whacks.
Yeah.
Which it was wrong. It was a hatchet. But they do have I haven't seen the actual, hatchet head, but they have a replica at the Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast Museum, which is a whole separate thing that we can talk about another time, and my mixed feelings about that place. But
yeah,
they have a replica there, and it's so small. It's much smaller than you would think.
Well, so is that what I was like freaking out a little bit in just a minute ago, because I'm not sure I know the difference between a hatchet and an axe. Is it size?
Yes.
Okay. So then exactly right. You get a sense of, it's this is the size and scale and what an item from that time period would have looked like. And that gives you a context to understand, the period of time and what happened.
And also one more, just one little interesting thing that I did read. One of the owners of one of these Murderabilia sites, they actually sold scraps from a bullet that was removed from the body. I believe it was a victim of the Aurora movie theater shooting. And this was someone who survived the attack, but they had been shot. And they are the ones that wanted to sell the item, and they got the money for selling the item. So that's another strange little twist that these stories can take.
That one sounds like an easy thing to fake to me too. But yeah, it's also, there's a lot to it. There's a lot to the story.
All right. Well, I think we should wrap up there. We've talked a lot about it. And it's, like we said, a very interesting idea, and it gives you a lot to think about, I think, is the main thing. That's the reason why I was attracted to it, because it seems so kind of lascivious, to begin with, and kind of like a dirty topic. And then you think about it, and it's like you kind of have to ask yourself, are there any circumstances where I would think it was okay, where I would be okay with it? And historically, in my opinion, yes, there are some. But then there's so many ways where I'm not okay with it, So that's what I was talking about when I said I kind of have to walk a line here, because I can see it both ways in some cases. And then there's other cases where, no, it's pretty cut and dry. So like I said, let's try to wrap up there, because I think we got through a lot of good points, and the show is running long. So I got some editing to do, but I'm sure it's going to turn out to be a good show. So thank you. Excellent. Thank you once again, Susan, for being a part of it.
And
thank you for having me.
Of course. Just before we go, I want to remind everyone to check out the website, spookyas.com. Find all the episodes, all the social media links, the Facebook link. Join the Spookaroos, where both I and Susan are active. So you can definitely come say hi to us there. And go ahead and share the show. And if you have not done so yet, please, pretty please, with sugar on top, write a kindly review on iTunes or wherever you happen to listen from, whether it's YouTube or Stitcher or iHeartRadio. Those reviews really do help and put the show out there, so hopefully we can get some more listeners and grow the Spookaroos. And I think that's it, right?
I think we covered it.
All right, so thank you once again, Susan. Like I said, maybe you'll come back and we'll talk more OJ. If he did it.
Oh, I would love to. Let's do it. I'll read the book. We'll do a book report episode.
All right, that's our book club reading assignment then.
Oh, I like it.
All right, until next time, don't be afraid.